Netflix is a name once exclusively associated with online distribution, but recently it's become a serious producer of original content. Here I'm looking at how Netflix challenges Hollywood, and how really it's becoming a significant part of it. Turn for effect, pause for punctuation.
As it encroaches into our window,
I don't think we're anywhere near saturation.
$1 billion to get the data.
Look at that data too.
Now when I say Hollywood, I'm referring to the industrialized manufacturing of film from inception to consumer delivery in the United States. Unlike Netflix, Hollywood isn't a single entity. There's no leadership, there's no mission statement, there's no clear definition of what it really is. Essentially, Hollywood is a system of interconnected entities and individuals that form and enable the components needed for an industry to produce and thrive. Like other industries and marketplaces, there are independent and smaller players, and major players who own and influence others. In Hollywood, there are few major players at the moment, and they have control over an enormous amount of the market. It's difficult to produce TV or film in the USA without one of these major studios being involved in some part of the production. Smaller production companies do exist, but often they exist by servicing the major studios seeking to outsource specialist work and limit liabilities, and small studios producing and distributing their own material are few and far between. Netflix publicly launched in 1998, a year after being founded, and began its life as an online DVD store. How modern.
Here's a better way to rent movies.
It was quick to lead consumer transition from physical rentals to virtual, from DVDs to streaming in the late 2000s, and since then it has dominated and become the world's biggest online subscription video service. But seemingly from an early point, Netflix had ambitions not simply to be a distributor, but also a producer. Since 2012, it's produced an enormous range of, that dreaded word, content. Or to be more specific, it's made a plethora of TV, original and picked up from elsewhere, and movies.
If anything, what I push our content teams on is you should have more things that don't work out. You got to get more aggressive.
At first, Netflix was commended for what was seen as high-quality original content, but since then, things have evened out. Netflix has been throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, and they're now reaching a point where they're producing more than they're buying in. Which I think is interesting because most people I know would never say original content as the answer for why they're using Netflix. I think most people use Netflix as cheap background noise to keep the panic out, no? In 2018, Icarus won Best Documentary at the 90th Academy Awards, really only 90 of them. It wasn't produced by Netflix, it was only distributed by them. In 2019, films distributed through Netflix were nominated for a total of 15 Academy Awards. 10 nominations for Roma, which won 3. 3 nominations for The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. 1 nomination for the Hindi language short documentary, Period, End of Sentence. And 1 for Endgame, not that Endgame, just Endgame. Netflix didn't make any of those films, it just distributes them. However, 15 nominations could be seen as a watershed moment in terms of what Netflix is. At the time of making this, numerous rumours were floating around concerning the board of AMPAS, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, and their view on the legitimacy of films distributed exclusively through streaming platforms being eligible for the Oscars. At least a faction inside the Academy apparently don't look on Netflix's participation too favourably, with Steven Spielberg himself at one point pushing for films to have to be screened for 4 weeks in theatres to be considered, something some onlookers have said to be a deliberate block, aimed specifically at Netflix. Now you might be wondering why the Oscars matter at all. I think the Oscars are very important in keeping industry access exclusive and stable. The Oscars, the Academy Awards, aren't so much anti-art as art irrelevant. Awards and recognition make no difference to artistic merit, but also if you look at the figures, they seem to make no difference to box office interest either. But the Oscars are very important to Hollywood, not as a celebration of film, not even as a self-relating industry event, but as a tool for providing and denying legitimacy. That's what this is all about, legitimacy, or really perceived legitimacy. Netflix doesn't really care about exposure or prestige, it cares what exposure and prestige can do for Netflix. And I think its recent search for legitimacy comes from Netflix being in a very weird place right now, where it needs to grow to sustain itself, but it also needs to invest in order to grow.
We're a learning organization, and it's the same virtuous cycle. Improve the service for our members, we grow. That gives us more money to invest. So it's the same things we've always been doing at just greater scale.
In this graph, you can see that Netflix's share price has grown, although that 2018 figure I took from the year's peak, and speaking now, it's about $50 shy of that. Still, you can see income and share price aren't super correlative. Sorry, is this sounding like a maths class? Here's a picture of Jeff Goldblum. I hear he's very popular with young people. Anyway, here's a second chart that's even more revealing. It shows a very healthy growth in revenue, but a far less energetic growth in income. Not to condescend, but if you don't know the difference, revenue is all the money that came in. Income is actual profit. So Netflix has seen an enormous swell in money coming in, but not really in money it has, or not as much. And that's because the company has been spending like crazy. In the end of 2018, Netflix announced it was raising $2 billion for more original content. For context, in 2018, the US box office brought in $11.9 billion. $11.9 billion. That's the box office takings for the biggest film market in the world in 2018. In 2018, Netflix's debt was $10 billion, and its total liabilities over $20. In 2018, Netflix spent $8 billion on original content. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't necessarily mean bad things. Netflix is profitable, and it reportedly has assets worth around $26 billion. Although assets do tend to be valued on possibly and maybe, not what people will pay for your shit as your house burns down, just saying. But spending $8 billion on new content, not on operating costs or advertising, just on new content, when net income is less than a quarter than that, well, it's making the Council of Evil nervous. In 2016, it cost Netflix, on average, $40 in advertising spend to attract a new customer. In 2018, it was $83. And get this, at the end of 2018, Netflix said that it plans to accumulate a total of 90 million accounts in the US. It said that before it even hit 60. But in 2018, it cost, on average, $340 of advertising spend for Netflix to attract a single new customer in the US. Not to sound too much like a census, but there are only 120 million households in the US, so Netflix wants to be in 3/4 of them forever. Surely its own meteoric rise shows that the market is volatile and constantly shifting. I think the figures show that Netflix is certainly hurtling towards something.
That 50% that hasn't signed up for Netflix, even though they've known about it for a long time, are they going to require something dramatically different in terms of an offering?
When we were 20 million, people said, well, HBO only got to 30, isn't there a wall there? And then we just kept on growing and making the shows better. So I would say it's mostly do what we do now and just do it better.
Netflix faces competition where once it had almost the entire playground to itself. Disney, for one, is developing its own platform where it'll essentially be able to ring-fence its own properties, and the power sort of lies with the IP holder. In that way, Netflix has built its home on land belonging to others. In theory, a number of the major studios could pull their content from Netflix, and although they would lose money by doing that, they could potentially kill a competitor, or at least if Netflix didn't have any of their own content. Now, I don't think anything like that would ever happen because I think too much money would be lost on all sides. But I think that is a genuine vulnerability, and I think Netflix knows it too.
Remember, our early investment in doing original content more than about 6 years ago was betting that this, there would come a day when the studios and networks may opt not to license us content in favor of maybe creating their own services, which was, that's a corner that I'm glad we saw around a few years ago.
It's apparent now that online content is going to be divided in one way or another, and that a single marketplace where you can watch anything, as Netflix might once have aspired to be, and perhaps as consumers once wanted it to be, isn't going to happen. There's money in exclusivity. As an example, long-running sitcom It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was on Netflix for years in its entirety. Now, if you want to watch all of the episodes, you'll have to spend more than $100 to get access.
Very nice performance, very nice and clean performance. Welcome!
So while Netflix has a dominating video-on-demand platform now, in a decade there's a good chance it will have less access to famous titles that it didn't produce, or at least a more contentious hold over them. Think of it like a producer. Do you want your show to get pennies on minutes watched, or do you want it to cost $15 as a one-off payment? I think the answer to that question will come down to popularity. So if successful shows follow the same example as Sunny, you end up with an exodus of popular content. That's essentially why Netflix is trying its hardest to make that killer show. In short, I think Netflix has worked out that transition to content production isn't just desirable, it's necessary. And this is the risky open ground between those two places. If it was smaller, it probably wouldn't have to do this, but I think it thinks it needs to do this to survive, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong.
It definitely changes the economics in terms of licensing films in later windows versus producing films, which is a more kind of front-loaded cash activity, but has a much better payback for us.
Netflix certainly cares enough to send its chief content controller in person to soothe Steven Spielberg. Spielberg et al. Have their own motivations for not wanting Netflix sweeping up Oscars, and as I said before, I think it's about control and ultimately access. But for Netflix, it's about that transition. To Hollywood, perhaps Netflix wants to have its cake and eat it, by becoming a major studio, but remaining a behemoth distributor. For Netflix, I think it's about sustainability, although them wanting to get 90 million households when they're clearly facing saturation at 60 leads me to believe that maybe it is just greed.
We compete so broadly with all of these different providers that any one provider entering, only makes a difference on the margin.
This is, to do my Michael Moore impression, what the unsinkable always say. Dramatic music here, note to self. I want to end by saying that I don't have anything against Netflix, I just come from a place where plans are perfect until they're not. I think Netflix has given a lot of opportunities to younger filmmakers, and it's certainly connected a great deal of people with content that they didn't even know existed, and that's a great thing. But historically, well, we'll see.
We're just continuing to work away on all the things that we've always done.
More of the same, but on a continued larger scale.
I don't foresee any change to our approach.
It's the same things we've always been doing at just greater scale.
Continue to make incredible shows, movies, give you more reasons to join, make the streaming great. There's more and more sales of smart TVs. So I think it'll be continuous.